Bonsoir tout le monde, bienvenue. Je m'appelle Rafiko Ruiz, je suis le directeur associé de la recherche ici au CCA. Nous commençons ce séminaire en reconnaissant que les peuples autochtones Ganegahage de Ganawage, Ganasatake à Kwasasne ont des connexions de longue date avec Tiohtià:ke, Muniang, Montréal. Leurs ancêtres, tout comme ceux des communautés Wendat et Anishinaabe et Abénaquis, vivaient sur ces terres bien avant l'arrivée des colons. Still today, the island is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. These communities continue to face challenges to their rights and the erosion of their traditional territories as a result of ongoing processes of settler colonialism. The CCA itself puts on exhibitions and events, maintains its collections, and publishes texts on these lands that have never been ceded by their indigenous inhabitants. The CCA therefore recognizes its settler colonial roots, and we are committed to fostering affirmative relationships with indigenous peoples across Tiohtià:ke, Muniang, Montréal, and beyond. We invite you to learn more about the CCA's ongoing commitment to our living land acknowledgement process by visiting our website or speaking to me after this event. I can share many more details. I also encourage all of you to spend time with Angeloff's Visibly Iroquoian installation, one portion of which you walked past on your way to this room. Ange, a Ganegahage artist, originally from Ganawage, was the first recipient of the CCA's Indigenous Land Restitution Research Creation Fellowship, through which, over 2 years, she created the installation and raised questions around caring for ancestral remains, archaeology and its evidence, and how we can see through the present to make out Iroquoian traces and designs, both in the past and in the future. So welcome to this evening's event, which is associated with our Toolkit for Today seminar. For those of you in the audience, be warned, there are PhD students sitting amongst you who are the core members of the Toolkit. So each annual Toolkit invites researchers to share their methods, topical questions, and objects of inquiry with the participants of the CCA's doctoral research residency program. The 2024 Toolkit has adopted a new format from previous iterations, and it's been made up of, a week-long program anchored by the theme Crosswords, Queer Worlds. Along with the cohort of 14 students in the CCA's doctoral research residency program, we've been joined by a team of amazing collaborators, seated here, of course, to convene around practices, imaginative projections, and experiences of queer trans world building in architectural history and the built environment more generally. So these collaborators include S.E. Eisterer. I don't know if I'm going to give a little wave, S.E. S.E. is an assistant professor in the School of Architecture at Princeton University, as well as a visiting fellow in the Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies program at University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. Malcolm Rio is a doctoral student at GSAP at Columbia University, was very recently a faculty member, teacher at the Rhode Island School of Design, and will be taking up a fellowship in Los Angeles this fall. Favor Idika, as part of the group, is is in their second year of Masters of Architecture at Princeton University. Welcome, Favor. Thanks for being here. Sergio Villanueva Preston is a presidential postdoctoral research fellow in the Office of the Faculty at Princeton University. Congratulations on this postdoc. I take it it's a tough one to get. Yeah. Thanks for being here, and thanks for hanging out this whole week. It's been fantastic. And as part of this core organizing collaborative team, we have Janus Lafontaine Carboni. They have taught very recently at EPFL and the ETH, and is an incoming postdoctoral fellow, an incoming Swiss National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellow in the School of Architecture at Princeton University. Very exciting that you'll be close to hear. Wonderful. And of course, we have our two guest speakers, Sage and Lafayette. Rio will formally introduce them, more than a one-sentence bio that I've provided our collaborators with tonight in the interest of time. So you'll get to know them much, much better in a few moments. I did just want to say a few words on the experience over the past week, just to try to invite all of you into what the Toolkit is and what we've been up to. So it's been a really exciting process of immersion, I would say, with our discussions weaving through a range of key crossing words. Words such as state, sex, sexuality, ecology, environment, decoloniality, all of these crossing words grounded in queer and trans theories of embodiment, non-normative knowledges, and collaborative thinking and making. I think the week has been, above all, characterized by intellectual and affective generosity. I think it's been really a sense of kind of moving together, both through the kind of spaces of the CCA, through the city, but also moving through really important methods and questions. And I'm really grateful that we've been able to do that together. And so I'm sure I speak on behalf of all the PhD students, also other research fellows here at the CCA who have been joining us over the course of the week, just to express really heartfelt gratitude to this core kind of organizational team for laying the groundwork for building new and inclusive methods that value queer and trans ways of moving through and building worlds. So thank you. And tonight we're convening around the possibilities and practices associated with queer pedagogies. Lafayette and Sage will speak to this open question, these possibilities and practices. And now I'll hand it over to Rio for introductions. The structure of the evening is very simple. We will have presentations by Lafayette, then Sage. Then we'll move to this table for a conversation. And after that, we'll open the floor to questions from all of you in the audience. So, les questions en français sont bien sûr les bienvenues. I think there's some French amongst this group, but we can translate very easily as well. And with that, Rio, further introductions.
Can you all hear me? Good evening. Thank you, Rafiko, and honestly, thank you for trusting us with this new format of the toolkit. As Rafiko mentioned, this week has been rich with immersion and really thinking about queer and trans methodologies to the level of an introduction. As he calls this, I believe, an introduction of kindness, so I'm going to do something that I'll admit I'm not super comfortable with, which is to not just read a clinical bio, but to kind of fold our relationality into it. And we've also been centering how in academia and in research, a lot of what really comes forward is through informal conversation and friendships. And I have the great honor, actually, of introducing two really good friends. I'll start off with Lafayette. It is my honor to introduce my really good Judy, Lafayette Cruise, who is an urban planner and futurist whose work is as imaginative as it is impactful. We first met at an elite institution that I will not name here, in which we instantly bonded over the shared trauma of being gaslit by elite institutions that claim to champion racial and social diversity, but resist structural growth. Our friendship flourished through countless hours of brain rotting over the internet, memes, and I will deeply miss our game nights and gay nights when I moved to LA. We were both in Providence. Lafayette is both beautiful and sensitive in his soul, whose perception of time is both radical and inspiring, albeit sometimes frustrating for my scattered, mercurial, brain-rotted soul. Lafayette's work invites us to explore the intersections of urban planning, speculative fiction, and vibrant, polychromatic, sonic imagination, drawing inspiration from diverse sources like Lenora Simpson's conceptual art, The Lord of the Rings, Avatar, The Last Airbender, and Star Trek. His practice is a testament to the interdisciplinary thinking in which he brings to RISD as well. His fascination with Chicago's bungalows and workmen's cottages shapes his unique perspective on urban design, while his love for Interstellar 5555, a visual realization of Daft Punk's Discovery album, underscores his appreciation for the fusion of music and animation. Focusing on expanding our collective imaginations of who and what belongs in our future, Lafayette centers on marginalized identities and spaces. His work spans multimedia projects and speculative fiction, creating aspirational futures through collaboration and innovation. His engagement with historical and cultural ephemera, from Black American social dances to Anansi folktales and Octavia Butler's speculative visions, grounds his futuristic outlook in a manner that is deep understanding of the past. Music is a cornerstone to Lafayette's life, shifting with his mood and the seasons. To relax, he listens to Alice Coltrane, Stevie Wonder, Nina Simone, and Amy Winehouse. For work, he listens to Kalela, My Brain Rot Loves, Charlie XCX, Beyonce, and others. And when it's time to party, he enjoys sets by great DJs who spin at Poppy Juice, reveling in the community of joy, music, and dance. He's also a proud bee in the Bayhive, though as a Libra, he tends to not want to be committed to such cosmic allegiances. Significant places for him includes the shores of Lake Michigan, from Milwaukee to Chicago, landscapes rich with personal and reflective meaning. In his free time, he enjoys reading, walking, daydreaming, tending to his plants, which he will get some when I move to LA, and collaging. He also loves attending parties with, as I said, great music, great people, and great joy. To conclude, for me, Lafayette is a beacon of imaginative thinking and creative exploration. And so please join me in giving a warm welcome to Lafayette, who I will then introduce Sage, but just... I am also very pleased to introduce Sage Gerson, an assistant professor of literary arts and studies at the Rhode Island School of Design. Sage is a settler scholar whose work weaves together indigenous literatures and ecologies, environmental justice, and speculative fiction, among other fields. Beyond her impressive credentials, Sage brings a deeply human and heartfelt approach to everything she does. I first met Sage at the Eddy, over drinks with another RISD faculty member who was part of a cluster hire around social equity, and we also instantly bonded over our shared experience of institutional gaslighting around diversity equity, particularly in terms of racial, gender, and sexual and non-Western knowledge practices that claim to both highlight them but also resist formative and structural change. Our discussions often reveal how such commitments falter when institutions must take risks, often financial, or lose status, or impose additional labor on established members rather than the newly highly members that hold such terms like social equity, diversity higher. Having Sage join our architectural reviews in RISD has led to profound rethinkings of supposedly immutable conditions within the built environment, and this is what I most appreciate about these cross-collaborations. She has also inspired my own thinking about architectural technology, specifically coming to learn there's something called critical data center studies, and how data centers need to be not thought of in only terms of technocratic processes, but the relationship to land, especially power, the power from the land, encouraging a more critical and imaginative approach to how we think about technology. Sage also draws on inspiration from visionary works by Octavia E. Butler, whose archives she has explored deeply, and Linda Hogan, the Chickasaw Nation writer in residence. Contemporary queer poets like Natalie Diaz, Ocean Vuong, Nikki Finney, and Fanny Choi enrich her perspective. Alexis Pauline Gumbs' essay, Undrowned, Black Feminist Listens from Marine Mammals, has been particularly inspiring for her students. Visual artist Laura Aguilar continues to move and challenge Sage, especially her self-portrait and stillness series. Her teaching and research are rooted in feminist, anti-racist, and equitable pedagogies. Sage views storytelling as a transformative cultural intervention. Her interdisciplinary research explores narratives challenging conventional understandings of the environment, identity, power, and resistance. Sage's reflections on her time in Octavia Butler's archives underscores the iterative nature of writing, and the radical potential of science fiction as a contemporary commentary. Music, too, is a constant champion in her life. She relaxes to Jungle's Back on 74, and I should have practiced this pronunciation, but and Krubin's Ala Sala? Did I butcher that? Oh, wow, okay. Karanga Bin's Ala Sala, works to Brittany Howard's What's Now, and parties to pop bangers, hopefully Charlie XCX. While Van Morrison's Astral Weeks is her relaxation go-to, she humorously suggests something cooler for public playlists. Significant places in Sage's life includes also Chicago, the Pacific Northwest, and Providence, each shaping her as a thinker and as a person. Sage's work is also, for me, a beacon of imaginative thinking and deep creative exploration and unraveling. It is my honor to welcome her as well, so please join me in giving her a warm welcome before Lafayette presents.
Hi, thank you. Before I get started, I just want to say thank you to the organizing team, to CCA for having me. It's always a joy sort of being an interloper in architectural spaces as an urban planner. Close that out. And I also want to thank Sage. It's been fun thinking about the way we collaborate and intersect, thinking about what we're going to talk about, how we talk about world building and queer and trans theory and pedagogy. Thank you. I've appreciated having you as a thought partner. So yes, my name is Lafayette Cruise. I am an urban planner and a futurist. That feels in flux at the moment because I feel like I'm a multi-hyphenate. I do lots of different things. I'm also an educator. The work I do tends to vary from writing speculative fiction to creative direction to collaging. I guess I also give a warning. There are a lot of GIFs in like bright colors. That doesn't disturb anyone. All collages that I've made and used for different projects. Urban planning is speculative fiction. I started my career as a transportation planner in Chicago. So thinking about the future of our networks and our infrastructure 20, 30, 40, 50 years into the future. And the thing that became frustrating for me, and I can imagine lots of people who deal with the built environment feel this frustration, are the limited types of questions that we ask of the future, both as planners, as architects, but I think as someone who's in service to the public, the sorts of questions that were asked of me of the future. And in particular, I think beyond that, who felt comfortable demanding their imagination of the future being real. And it's interesting sort of sitting in these cities and these built structures, they feel very inherent. The way we're taught history is this sort of progressive thing, but they're not. Someone imagined this. Someone told a story, convinced someone to invest their labor, to invest their money, and because of that story, because of that heft of that story, of that fiction, it became a reality. And so I left the sort of discipline purity of urban planning, which I don't think urban planning is particularly a pure discipline. I like approaching stories from a planning perspective because it takes systems and history. It thinks of cities not just as a collection of buildings or a collection of roads or just the people that are there or history, but as this agglomeration of contradictory and complementary things. And so with this project that I want to talk to you about, this Musings from the Margins of the Polychrome Future, it really emerged as a way to imagine, or to see, can we imagine more? Can we ask different questions? Can we ask and center different stories and different ways of being? Why is it that all our transportation systems tend to be spoke and wheel? What happens if we prioritize a different person's body and desires and way of engaging with the city? And I think beyond that, the work that I try to do is also assert that the fictitious stories, the speculations of the marginalized are just as valid, demanding not just affordable housing, but free housing is not ridiculous. I would like to center a trans and queer perspective. It's not other. What happens when it's centered? What happens when cis-hetero perspective is the radical other? And part of that, that I like to focus on is, in particular, this phrase, this word polychrome, in the way in which speculative fiction creates an entire world. It's interesting sort of looking around this room and seeing these, we have some gilt and gilding on the roof, but seeing the columns and the pillars and the detail and seeing sort of the architectural lineage that these white walls are trying to speak to. And it is interesting thinking about, especially coming from an American context, the way in which monochromy and the whiteness of ancient Rome and ancient Greece has formed a mythology of the lineage we come from. We come from Greco-Roman democracy. We come from all of these things, and yet that's not true. Even though we've built our structures and our architecture, our buildings of power to emulate a lineage, that lineage wasn't true. It should be colorful, but it's not. And I don't know if anyone's seen previews for the new Gladiator movie. Yeah, no. There's been online chatter recently because they used a rap song in one of the previews, and Denzel Washington is in it, and people are hurt. How on earth could there be a black person in ancient Rome, this cross-border multinational empire that exists along the Mediterranean? Who on earth can imagine a black man? And yet, that position is seen as normative. It's seen as radical to insert any sort of body that is non-white. And we've created, particularly from the American perspective, we have a mythology that struggles to imagine Native people, black people, queer people, any sort of immigrant identity. It seems as other, it seems as false. Seems like it's inserting itself when in reality, it's been there and will continue to be there. There's this quote from David Batchelor's Chromophobia that I like to focus on. It's early on in his book where he's talking about sort of the evolution of the color white from just a color to having a deeper meaning. And he says, but it's one thing not to know that Greek statues were once brilliantly painted. Is another thing to not see color when it is still there. This seems to speak less of ignorance than of a kind of denial, not perceiving what is visibly there. Psychoanalysts call this negative hallucination. And so in the work that I do, I don't find it particularly radical to assert that there are other bodies, both in the past, but in the present, and thus their declaration that we ought to shape our cities, shape our structures, shape our buildings to serve them, to center them, I don't find it particularly radical. And so in the projects I engage with, it is trying to add color, both in the future. I don't know if has anyone been to an Apple store? And this sort of, that is the vision of the future. Clean, straight white lines, white and chrome. I don't know if you've seen a person, but they're not very good at keeping those sorts of things clean. And yet that is supposed to be the future. That's the technology. And so I'm gonna insert color. I also wanna, as I'm speaking, I also wanna realize I keep using the word future. And Rio sort of alluded to it, but I find even, especially in the work of the built environment, is making assertions of the past, but also about the future. Who do you expect to occupy a space? how do you expect that space to continue? What does it mean when we paint narratives of a town, of a city, when we think about the future of Montreal? I'm not going to try the French, I apologize. And there's this thing that I also try to focus on. It's very, I don't know if folks know The Mushroom at the End of the World and Anna Tsing's work. But there's this quote in the introduction where she talks about third nature and this idea of noticing. Noticing sort of these fringes and these opportunities for alternative ways of being. And in it, she says, to even notice third nature, we must evade assumptions that the future is that singular direction ahead. Like virtual particles in a quantum field, multiple futures pop in and out of possibility. Third nature emerges within such temporal polyphony. And often when we think, I talk about lineage, we think of it as sort of the static and set thing. It's also interesting being in an archive, you look at these artifacts as sort of static and set or neutral. But what I hope we've already shown is that a misinterpretation of static objects creates a mythology, creates a society, creates a destructive global settler colonial regime. And maybe in that mythology, the way forward is positive. But I think what we can argue when we look at the margins is that maybe forward doesn't look how we were told it ought to. It won't look like continuing in a direction, but maybe it's a different direction. Even in the sort of engagement with the archive, you are altering both the past and in some regards, altering the future. I know a lot of this week, there's also been discussion of just feeling the city and of the body. As I think about the work of Musings from the Marginal and Polychrome Future, it's also trying to decenter sort of the lineage of knowledge hierarchies. In the sorts of projects I've done, I'm curious of how does the body remember the future? How does it, like urban planning and its tropes, and the way in which you insert something to have sort of predictive models. So you see the structures of this building, your body has already been predicting what sort of activities will happen there. And so I'm curious of how we how we challenge those tropes and create different expectations beyond just the mind, but also in the body. There's this great quote that I like to think about from Audre Lorde, where she says, "The white fathers told us, 'I think, therefore I am.' And the black mothers in each of us, the poet whispers in our dreams, 'I feel, therefore I can be free.' Poetry coins language to express and character this revolutionary awareness and demand, the implication of that freedom." I think it's interesting being in this space as a quasi-academic, questionable, we'll put an asterisk at that, because I think and feel that the constraints in the lineage that we have limit the freedoms that we could actually be producing. I'm a queer black man from the Midwest. Malcolm referenced my love of Lake Michigan and my love of Chicago. And my love of music. And in particular, I love Chicago house music and Detroit techno music. And I don't know if there's the scholar out of the UK, Danveer Singh Brar, who I like to use a sort of simplified version as he talks about the methodological approaches of those two genres of, when you think of house and techno and black electronic dance music, the goal of them is to find new ways to keep you dancing, to be in your body and thinking of something new. But they do it in slightly different but similar ways. And I think, especially as you all engage with the archives, I think this also offers a methodology for you. So when you think of house music in Chicago, it was these black queer DJs finding old records and trying to use new technology with these old sounds to make a new sound, to dream up a space. It's fun talking to older DJs who are like, yeah, it's future church at night, then you'd party until like 4 in the morning or 7. What was it? Because you would party at church at night, you'd go out, maybe wash your face, and then you go to real church the next day. In this way, it offers a new vision to both feel and urge in and create a new future. And then you have Detroit techno, which is using new technologies to like putting it through a funk framework and seeing how far you can push it. To really, in both of these, it's like to really reimagine a space for Blackness and queerness and Black queerness in these large United States cities that were, at that moment, experiencing great economic and population upheaval, to assert that there is both life in this place, but also the way forward doesn't have to be what the market, what capital, what the powers that be would say. Yeah, I feel, therefore I am free. The thing I like about speculative fiction, the thing I like about urban planning is the need for specificity. And when I think about feeling, I think often in our practices we're trained to speak in universal terms. I hated econ, but I know the frame like, what was that, human economicus, or whatever, the like economic man, the sort of rational man. But the thing I love about challenging tropes is like, you gotta be specific. I don't think there is one economic man. I struggle with econ mostly because I don't make the same decisions and like it's supposed to be a logic and I do not understand that logic. And I think that is fine and I believe that is valid because someone's errant logic is what created the structures that we have. Homelessness isn't inherent, but someone's vision of the future was okay with that. As I come to sort of this conclusion, I've put these sort of, I hope the collages sort of emulate this sort of collaging of the speech, of just juxtaposing a bunch of different thoughts, a bunch of different musings. I think what I hope is useful for you is the call and the necessity for the polychrome futures that each of you can produce. In focusing on the marginal, and focusing on the specificity, and focusing on not just what is in your mind, but what is in your body, you both urge and usher in new worlds. We get to make these claims both about the archive, but also about the future. I think it can be I think the visuals, but also, as Rio will sometimes speak to, my embrace of time and truth can be disorienting. But I think disorientation is how we disrupt hegemony. Hegemony. Let's mess that up. Yeah, I'm going to leave it there. I had more to say, but I will leave it there. I look forward to engaging with you all, the spectrums of the worlds that you are pulling forward, that you're wishing. Yeah, thank you for listening to some of these musings. And yeah, I look forward to making the polychrome future with all of you. Thank you.
Hello, hi. I am a little nervous following Lafayette because I am an academic. And so I'm worried that my talk is a lot less fun. And it's certainly less colorful, but I'm gonna do my best. I just wanna thank CCA and the Toolkit for Today team for bringing me here and Lafayette for our last 2 years of conversation. I'll just dive in. Okay. So when I was invited to dialogue with you all this evening, the organizers asked Lafayette and me to speak about world building. what it is and why it matters. I have to confess, I overprepared and spent this afternoon cutting a bunch of pages out of this talk, and I'm a little bit nervous. World building is a broad concept, and I think it is important to acknowledge one that isn't inherently feminist or queer, but I'm gonna make the case here that it can be made so. I'm also not an architect nor an architectural historian. I am a professor of literature. So while preparing, I was thinking about what I could offer you, the Toolkit for Today and CCA fellows, that would be most helpful. I did a little speculating of my own and imagined that instead of deep diving into my research, what would be most useful to you would be a set of interlocking provocations about what employing world building as a framework makes possible, along with a variety of supporting citational sources, examples, and explanations, and some prompting questions. I hope that my instinct was right, though I'm happy to speak more about my research and/or engagement with world building as a teacher more thoroughly in the discussion to follow, so just ask, really. Okay, I've organized my talk into 4 sections. I'll start with an overview of what world building is, then I'll deep dive into each of my 3 provocations or very loose claims about world building, which are as follows. 1, world building gives us a framework for talking about narrative in a material and embodied way. It can be a shorthand for referring to the way cultural constructions become materialized. And Lafayette's talk kind of pointed to this, the way they're materialized in architecture, in urban planning, in land relations. 2, world building can be used to both diagnose the impasses of the present and make it possible to imagine beyond impasse. And this moving beyond need not be linear. And 3, I believe that world building can be employed as a methodological intervention because it encourages a generative interweaving of the critical and the creative. So, what is world building? At its most basic, world building is the process of constructing a world. The concept of world building really arises from science fiction and fantasy and gaming, especially open world games and role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons. If anyone here has been a dungeon master, you know your real job is to create a fictional world for your player characters to interact with, right? That's what you're doing. In its more original form, world building is most often associated with the construction of imaginary and/or fictional worlds. And while it has its roots in specific genre and fan communities, it is a useful framework beyond science fiction and fantasy because it refuses to dichotomize the sociocultural and material world. World building fosters attention to aesthetics and politics because it requires a consideration of systems of power, including economics and currency, infrastructure, human-environmental relations, histories of race and racism, gender roles, and the performance of gender, to name a few. I don't know if there are any lady gamers out there, but there's nothing that breaks the coherency of an imagined world than shitty gender politics and unbelievable representations, right? So to be a good world builder, you have to be paying attention to power. I think it's probably a good idea to gloss here how science fiction operates as a genre in order to illuminate the links between genre and world building, as well as build a bridge between world building's origins and the way that has been taken up by scholars both within literary studies, so my field, and outside of it. So what is science fiction? Darko Suvin, the first literary scholar to take science fiction seriously nearly 50 years ago, and I have to pause here to say, literary studies, like all academic disciplines, is fraught with fucked up hierarchies. So for a long time, the only literature studied in departments was highly literary. So popular genre fiction, like romance, science fiction, fantasy, detective novels, were not taught within the academy. So while I'm critical of Darko Suvin's kind of genre gatekeeping, he really was the first scholar to take science fiction seriously and bring it into a hostile academy and advocate for why it mattered, right? So he defined science fiction as the literature of cognitive estrangement. He describes science fiction as a mirror, but the mirror is not only a reflecting one, it is a transforming one. So it shows the reader their reality, but with difference. Science fiction, then, for Suvin, is a literary genre whose main formal device is an imaginative framework alternative to the author's empirical environment. So to rephrase him, he theorizes that science fiction is a genre of literature that provides productive critical distance between the world and the reader, and that uses believable developments which are not for him, necessarily limited to science and technology, but could include cultural developments, linguistic developments, to transform the recognizable present world for its readers. In some presumptuous approaches to science fiction, Samuel Delany, one of the first openly queer science fiction writers of color, explains that science fiction is not about the future. It uses the future as a narrative convention to present significant distortions of the present. Science fiction is about the current world, Delany writes, the given world shared by writer and reader. So combining Suvin and Delany's theories about how science fiction operates, we see that as a genre, it lends itself to a critique of the present, whether through a process of cognitive defamiliarization, which is Suvin, or through using futurity as a narrative convention to comment on the current world, like Delany. I understand science fiction's urge to transform the recognizable present to be part of world building's conceptual inheritance. World building can be one of the processes through which science fiction creators transform their imagined world. It can provide the futuristic setting that temporally distorts the creator's present. In my understanding, this genre-based genealogy showcases how world building can act as a creative process of deconstructing and reconstructing worlds, both real and imagined. But science fiction as a genre has a lot of problematic power dynamics and genre tropes that draw on long histories of white supremacy, colonial imaginaries, and assuming white masculinity as an invisible norm and prerequisite of personhood. Traditionally, the genre imagines and narrates worlds that extend the white cishet male explorer as the ideal human into the future. So when I teach my science fiction courses at RISD, I teach it through the concept of visionary fiction, a Black feminist intervention in the genre coined by Walida Imarasha and Adrienne Maree Brown, inspired by Octavia Butler's work. They coined the term visionary fictions as a way of distinguishing science fiction that has relevance toward building new, freer worlds from the mainstream strain of science fiction, which most often reinforces dominant narratives of power. Drawing on the long genealogy of thought within the Black radical tradition of the liberatory power of the imagination, Imarasha and Brown write, whenever we try to envision a world without war, without violence, without prisons, without capitalism, we are engaging in speculative fiction. All organizing is science fiction. Furthermore, they go a step further and assert that it is our responsibility to imagine beyond the boundaries of the real, and then do the hard work of sculpting reality from our dreams. So teaching science fiction through visionary fictions enables me to encompass a variety of futurity frameworks in my classes, including Afrofuturism, Indigenous futurities, queer futurity, feminist futures, disability futures, and more. Now is a good time for me to seed a Q&A topic. So in the discussion that follows, I'm always enthusiastic to receive and to give incredible science fiction recommendations. I realize in this talk, what I really like to do is fangirl great science fiction. That's really how I see my role as a teacher and scholar. And here I'm trying to theorize with you about the importance of the genre, and so I don't give a lot of reading recs. So if we want to talk about that, just make a note. So anyway, teaching science fiction through visionary fictions also enables me to challenge my students through our assignments to craft their own works of visionary fiction, to diagnose and imagine beyond their own impasses of the present. And I've had amazing work from students who've designed websites to be aesthetically accessible to visually impaired people, as a way of thinking about how disability doesn't need to be a tacked-on design element, or accessibility. Like, I always think about the historic buildings with the ramps tacked onto the front. That is such a diminishment of the kind of aesthetic challenge that accessibility poses. I've had students who imagine a world where everyone has to take place-based, environmental justice-oriented education as part of K through 12 and what that does for their environmental relations. It's really exciting to see students pick an issue and build a world based off of it. So all of this in sum, again, to say, what Suvin and Delany's definitions of science fiction and Imarasha and Brown's concept of visionary fiction and world building all have in common is an acknowledgement of the critical and transformative power, the world-making potential of the narratives we tell. So, okay, I just tried to convince you that world building is this important concept, we should all think about it, and now, to back myself up, I'm going to share some sources. So an interdisciplinary array of scholars have explicitly taken up the concept of world building or world making, and I'll use the two terms interchangeably here, in a variety of ways. Arturo Escobar, in his book Designs for the Pluralverse, Radical Interdependence, Autonomy, and the Making of Worlds, draws on Zapatista political slogans to advocate for a world in which many worlds fit. He takes a critical design approach to world making, pushing us to design alternatives in order to build the worlds we desire. Additional examples include Mark Jung's 2018 book, Racial World Making, The Power of Popular Fiction, which links genre, world building, and racial representation. Jung theorizes the process of racialization beyond the visual, arguing that we are taught when, where, and how to notice race by a set of narrative and interpretive strategies that have everything to do with world building. Adam Getachew, a political scientist, uses the concept of world making in her 2019 book, World Making After Empire, The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination. Her book focuses on the history of decolonization and anti-colonial struggle in Africa and the Black Atlantic. She enters this history through the concept of world making because it allows her to trace a more complex and nuanced account of decolonization beyond the process of post-colonial nation building to more expansively gesture to the ways Black thinkers and politicians challenged international racial hierarchies and articulated alternative visions for the world that were not solely about the nation state. Playwright and ethnic studies scholar Doreen Kondo's 2018 book, World Making, Race, Performance, and the Work of Creativity, also takes up world making as a way of thinking about how creativity can transform what is pre-given about the world we inhabit. She asserts that aesthetic genres make worlds through form and narrative. For her, the concept of world making evokes socio-political transformation and the impossibility of escaping power, history, and culture. Worlds like language are pre-given, and remaking must always work with this givenness. Above all, she writes, world making calls forth political action animated by political hope. In making our artistic and scholarly work, and in political activism conventionally defined, we try to transform the world we inhabit. Okay. So I know I threw a lot of scholarship at you just now, but I wanted to offer an overview of some of the scholarship on world making in order to demonstrate that the theoretical and conceptual work the concept enables is interdisciplinary. It moves beyond science fiction and gaming into race, ethnic, and indigenous studies, performance studies, critical design, history, and political theory. Plus, looking at these 4 projects from across disciplines altogether also highlights some of the moves world building makes possible for scholars. They show that paying close attention to world building encourages readers to track how both literary and real worlds have been constructed and to whose design, the political and social imaginaries, intended outcomes and impacts, and affects of systems of power and their infrastructure systems, what resistance might look like, and what it would take to build a new world from the scraps of a pre-existing one. Okay, enough preamble. I promised you 3 world building provocations. The first, taking a material and embodied approach to narrative. This is a very different approach to literary studies than is traditionally practiced within Western academia, and quite different than the methods I was originally trained in. And I think many students who had to take English classes in high school or in undergrad can relate to this. Too often, students are taught that the world of the text, the literary content, exists somewhere over here, separate from the material world that they inhabit. I've always struggled against this and struggled to put language to why this antiquated method of formal close reading is unfulfilling, limiting, problematic. This is one of the reasons that my version of Introduction to Literary Studies, which is a class all RISD undergraduate first years are required to take, is thematized literary world making. World building gives us a conceptual framework for approaching the material and embodied consequences of our cultural narratives. I would be remiss here not to pause and mention that how we read, listen to, and encounter storytelling and narrative is not universal. Other cultures have different approaches and cultural relationships to storytelling. Native North American cultural relationships to story already understand it as material, relational, ecological, embodied, as a form of survivance, to borrow Gerald Visner's term. And as I mentioned earlier, the Black radical tradition recognizes that the map to a new world already exists in the imagination. So when I think about world building as an intervention, I'm really thinking about it as an intervention into an antiquated Western practice of formal close reading. Okay, I have 3 examples to share with you that briefly demonstrate why attention to world building can help us unpack the cultural constructions shaping specific spatial formations and environmental relations, moments in history, and technologies. The board game Catan, let's talk about it. Its tagline is trade, build, settle. The game teaches its players competition, development, and extraction. And it provides a generative case study for unpacking Western colonial world building. Catan, formerly named Settlers of Catan, but rebranded with no rule changes, in 2015 to simply Catan, was invented and first released in Germany. It quickly became one of the most popular board games in the world, selling more than 32 million units by 2020. Catan's hexagonal game board requires spatial and site-specific thinking while relying on subtler approaches to geography and cartography. If one plays Catan as intended, the game begins with settlers arriving on the seemingly empty Isle of Catan. Throughout the game, players, here, when I say players, here settlers, in the words of the game's manufacturers, and these are quotes, tame Catan and reach victory by clever trading and cunning development. Players are rewarded with victory points for increasing their number of settlements, developing their settlements into cities, building roads, and purchasing development cards, which grant players things like soldiers and militias, libraries, and other markers of Western civilizational development. All of the island's non-human beings and multi-species relationships have been reduced to resources, some extracted as ore and brick, and some agriculturally cultivated such as sheep and wheat. And these resources fuel each settler player's developments. Catan, or Catan, is an example of the ways colonial narratives and imaginaries are shared, become common knowledge, and shape people's being in the world. It is no surprise, and also extremely telling, that Catan's press coverage highlights its popularity in Silicon Valley. The Wall Street Journal reports that Settlers has become so popular in Silicon Valley that it's now being used as an icebreaker at some business meetings. And as the Washington Post reports, it has become a necessary social skill among entrepreneurs and venture capitalists. The game's list of international licensing partners reads much like a list of global north countries and regions with a long history of imperialism and empire, with a few exceptions. Catan is not the only Euro-American Western game that hails its players into a playful capitalist and colonial matrix. Many popular games, such as the Oregon Trail, which today is a cult favorite, but once a 1990s US public school staple, immerse their players in settler colonialism through a normalizing casual quotidian playfulness. Games, as Linda Chang writes in her book, Playing Nature, the games straddle multiply real and imagined worlds. Chang reframes games as boundary objects that facilitate passage between the material and seemingly immaterial contexts of the physical world and the play space. In short, Catan is one example of the impacts of popular game world building, the normalization and prevalence of settler colonial culture. My second example, California is a story. California is many stories. In the 16th century, Spanish conquistadors named California after a fictional island in the then popular novel, and I apologize in advance for my Spanish accent, Las Sergas de Esplandian. In the novel, the fictional island of California was inhabited solely by beautiful and dark-skinned women and ruled by a queen named Califia. The Spanish mistakenly believed that the peninsula of Baja California was an island, which we know it's not, and that it was ruled by such women. Thus, they named it California. This account of the naming of California showcases the entangled ways that literary imaginaries shape colonial fantasies about race, gender, and geography, and how these fantasies continue to influence histories of place and land relations. And I couldn't help but put this up there, but I don't know if you all see this Califia brand almond beverage, but whenever I see this, I think about this naming process and the way that these conquistador legacies continue to shape places that we think we're familiar with, right? And the way that they're romanticized then by late-stage capitalism. Okay, my third and final example of these moments where stories become material is the taser. The taser was invented by NASA scientist John Cover and was, in his own terms, conceptualized as a tool to immobilize threats. Cover based the taser on and named it after one of his favorite childhood books, Tom A. Swift and his electric rifle, Taser. Book 10 in the Tom Swift series, published in 1911, depicts Tom using his latest invention, the electric rifle, to hunt for ivory in Africa. This genealogy of the taser imagines the then as yet fictive electric rifle participating in the colonial fantasy of big game safari hunting. The imperialist adventure novel also imagines that the rifle's ability to recalibrate the voltage of its electric bolt makes it the perfect weapon for the serialized Swift, and this is a quote from the book, to control, guide, or kill the native people he meets. In short, the novel is overtly racist and disparaging. The taser becomes a material technology based on the racist and colonial world building of the Tom A. Swift books. Understanding this helps provide the historical and imaginative context for the racist ways the US colonial police state continues to use the taser today. Remember, Cover imagined the taser as a tool to immobilize threats, and the literary imaginary he based it on imagined these threats to be colonized and racialized people. Second provocation, impasse and beyond. What I'm trying to do today is build an argument for world building as a framework that helps us understand the intentionality and design of the world everyone in this room has inherited. How did the fucked up present come to be and by whose design? And how do we build a different world from its scraps? Our present is made up of multiple interlocking impasses, that which is keeping us from a socially and environmentally just transition away from fossil fuels, trapping us in what Jose Esteban Munoz calls straight time, fueling ongoing capitalism and colonialism and blocking land back and other anti-colonial efforts of re-indigenization. World building provides a conceptual springboard for us to not only diagnose these impasses, but enables us to quote Munoz, in the face of the here and now's totalizing rendering of reality, to think and feel a then and there. World building challenges us to take our queer, trans, and feminist perspectives and commitments and use them as the building blocks to reimagine, re-narrate, re-experience, and rebuild the world. How might we imagine, narrate, and build a world that fosters queer affects such as desire, anticipation, and playfulness? How might we foster queer ecological relationships like those brought into being by the ecosexual perspective of Earth as lover instead of Earth as mother, as the foundation for ecofutures committed to pleasure, abundance, exuberance, reciprocity, and care, even in the face of the extractive ecologics of our shared present? Like bell hooks, I understand the classroom to be the most potentially radical space in the academy. I also think of pedagogy as a form of world building. Feminist pedagogy acknowledges students bring their whole selves into the classroom and demands an educational model that does not continue to reinscribe mind-body dualisms. Feminist pedagogy can build a different classroom, even within the pre-given conditions of the academy we've inherited. So here's another seed for the following Q&A. I'm always thrilled and eager to talk about concrete pedagogical strategies and practices instead of just offer you some high-level theory about it. But I recognize I'm coming up against time. So my third provocation, world building as methodological intervention. I'd like to conclude my talk by asking you all to remember back to what Doreen Kondo had to say about world building. I find her focus on remaking in her definition of world building, how we transform the pre-given, to be a particularly useful framework for talking about world building as a critical times creative method. And I'm using times intentionally to be more abundant than either of those things on their own. So emphasizing the importance of interweaving the critical and the creative is particularly salient to me as a liberal arts professor in an art and design context. For me, teaching is really where epistemologies and methodologies are enshrined and are reified. Too often I've found that scholarship prioritizes critical engagement over creative engagement, and creators don't view research and theorizing as creative pursuits. I want my students to leave my classes recognizing that the two are not dichotomous, but co-productive. Scholarly work is important for artists because it enables their making practice to take on new depth, context, and conceptual power when it is informed by theory and research. Likewise, scholarship is able to produce knowledge differently, is transformed by integrating the creative. So what are some concrete examples of scholars who interweave the creative and critical? How might you, as fellows, employ world building as a methodology for engaging the CCA archives? The work of two incredibly important and influential scholars comes to mind for me when I try to answer this question. The first is the work of feminist and queer Esalen and Chumash scholar and poet Deborah Miranda, who I mentioned briefly yesterday in our discussion. Her 2014 book, Bad Indians, a Tribal Memoir, has just celebrated its 10-year anniversary with a new expanded edition. And Miranda's book is a mixed media hybrid text, or what she calls a mosaic, in which she employs multiple narrative perspectives and multiple forms of storytelling, including poetry, short story, letters, archival research, redaction, annotation, which I've shared an excerpt of on the board, her annotation, oral history, and the recounting of dreams. The book began as an archival project about Miranda's ancestors' experiences of the genocidal California mission system and a pedagogical response to California Public Schools' requirement of the 4th grade mission project. In her memoir, Miranda uses her skills with language, particularly her commitment to poetry and poetics, to transform the colonial sources and perspectives she relies on to tell the history, record the present, and speculate about the future of her community and her family. The Esselen people were the first Native nation in California to be labeled extinct by anthropologists, a label that remains despite their presence and continued survivance. When I teach Bad Indians, I pair it with an assignment which I call Storytelling from Within the Archives, in which I ask students to conduct research into their own kin networks, human and more than human, and from this research create their own mosaic text that requires them to employ multiple forms of narrative. There is much to be learned from how Miranda uses creative narrative strategies to transform the stories her research tells and to remake the world that the archives authorize. The second methodological offering is Saidiya Hartman's concept of critical fabulation, which she coins toward the end of her essay, Venus in Two Acts. Hartman's essay is focused on the gaps of the archive as it relates to enslaved people. In response to archival omission, Hartman uses storytelling as a creative methodology that enables her to imagine what was and what could be. In Venus in Two Acts, she asks, is it possible to exceed or negotiate the constitutive limits of the archive? She answers her own question, stating, by advancing a series of speculative arguments and exploiting the capacities of the subjunctive, a grammatical mood that expresses doubts, wishes, and possibilities, in fashioning a narrative, which is based upon archival research, and by that I mean a critical reading of the archive that mimes the figurative dimensions of history. I intended both to tell an impossible story and to amplify the impossibility of its telling. The intention here isn't anything as miraculous as recovering the lives of the enslaved or redeeming the dead, but rather laboring to paint as full a picture of the lives of the captives as possible. The method guiding this writing practice is best described as critical fabulation. Fabula denotes the basic elements of story, the building blocks of the narrative. By playing with and rearranging the basic elements of the story, by re-presenting the sequence of events in divergent stories and from contested points of view, I have attempted to jeopardize the status of the event, to displace the received or authorized account, and to imagine what might have happened, or what might have been said, or it might have been done. Elsewhere, in relation to her method of critical fabulation, Hartman has also explained it as employing beauty as both a practice and a method that might enable some kind of redress. Even in the face of beauty as a discourse that she acknowledges is structured by violence, white supremacy, and colonialism, Hartman insists that there is something, in her words, to steal from beauty that might provide a possible antidote to the violence that is part of the everyday. And so this is my little plug if you want to learn more. The African American Policy Forum did a series under the blacklight during COVID, and this is my favorite of the series. It's a conversation between Saidiya Hartman and speculative fiction writer N.K. Jemisin, and it's moderated by Kimberly Crenshaw, the scholar who coined the term intersectionality, so it's just super dope. Put it on when you're doing dishes or cooking or walking your dog. It's an amazing resource. It's on YouTube. So, really, this time to conclude, as Hartman and Miranda's archival-based work illustrates, how we tell stories matters. Narrative, literature, poetics, beauty, all contain the possibility to remake the world as we desire it. The stories we tell and how we tell them can be forms of cultural intervention and fuel for reimagining and rebuilding the world. Thank you.
Essentially, when S.A. Smythe came on Monday, we had a conversation about the tension between desires to both not necessarily correct the archive, but kind of think of radical figures that elude the archive to kind of surface them in the work that we might do, but also the risk of making them static. In Lafayette, one of the things you said that really stuck with me was that the misinterpretation of a static object creates a mythology, which can create a world, right, and creates a future. And so I'm wondering how you look, generally for the whole panel, but for our two world builders here, how you might look at world building as resisting that staticness, even though it's written as a text, how it might find ways to be fluid, in the ways that sometimes historical writing, right, does not want to be fluid or consistently change.
I'm a big fan and advocate for rereading because I think every time you encounter a text, it changes because you change. And I think there's a way in which if we approach these aesthetic and narrative objects with an open mind and we do it iteratively, it gives us a model for how we might engage something as not static. I'll also say, at the expense of making historians mad, I am a proud presentist. Cultural objects continue to exist in time, and how I read them and engage with them changes because I live right now in 2024 in my body in this world. And so, of course, I'm going to be encountering a historical object through my own embodiment, through my own knowledge, my own relationships, my own land relations. And so I don't honestly care if I'm totally historically accurate because I think being committed to historical accuracy is itself a fiction that we tell. So I think approaching something through a presentist lens can help us be not static. And then something that I do with my students is ask them to think about different models for time besides a linear one. And I actually mean visual models. And I think that this can actually be really helpful, especially if you are an artist or designer and you think visually. I had a mentor in grad school who used to like to say, linear time or industrial time, as she called it, is a straight line mad dash from birth to death. It always ends in the grave. And so when I talk to my students about this, we talk about visualizations for how to make our experience of linear time perceptible to us. So we talk about railroad tracks. Something that I like to do is create a little timeline where every single dash on the board is another iPhone update. iPhone 1, iPhone 2, iPhone 3, into the future, right? That's how capitalism helps us reinscribe a kind of linear or static relationship throughout time. And so my students and I then look around us and try to find other models. The Nautilus is a big one, so spiraling in and spiraling out. I'm also a big advocate for seasonality, a kind of cyclical return, right? I think that gets to my iterative reading practices, but what does it mean to experience time in a cyclical way? A river is another example with eddies and curves. I don't think that there is anything really static in the world that we live in. We create that through the narratives that we tell. I don't know if that's a good answer, but I think if we look for other models of time, we move into things with movement and that change.
I think that was great.
Thanks.
Thank you. I have a question. It's a little bit maybe unformed. And I think this was present in both of your talks, but I wonder if you could just maybe make it more apparent. So my understanding of world making, right, is a kind of confrontation with hegemony. To think about maybe something like Adrian Rich, right, to confront the common world of men, to see all of the ways in which hegemony operates in this like multi-scalar and like totalizing way, right, that controls both our understandings of ourselves, our comportment, our relationships to history, the way that we play games, right? So it like I think that's the confrontation, is that you can't just pick one sort of scale to approach it at, but you have to really like remake a world. And so my question is like, in confronting world, or in starting to consider queer world making or feminist world making, what is it that will inoculate those practices against merely replacing, let's say, like a heteronormative world with a homonormative world, right? Like, what are the things about queerness or feminism that allows a world that isn't merely just like changing who gets to be on top, who gets to sort of pull the levers, but is actually attempting a new kind of a project of liberation. And I think that was like partly already maybe in this idea of stasis, but I was hoping that you can maybe both bring it out and like what is it in the polychrome world that won't just become, like a more brightly colored fascism or something. Do you know what I mean? Like, yeah. Does that question make sense? Oh, yeah, cool.
So this is where reading a lot of speculative fiction I think is useful. So The Power is a novel that I have to confess I don't particularly like. But in it, it imagines a world where there's a gender power reversal, and it's facilitated by women, and in the novel this includes trans women, developing a new organ called a skene that allows them to produce electricity in their bodies, and thus they can overpower and shock men. And so they use this to flip how gendered power dynamics work in the world, and the author imagines it as a dystopia. So the feminist future that the novel ushers in is just as violent, is just as coercive, is just as non-consensual. It's just different who's on top. So I think a little bit about this. That was an unintended double entendre. I think a little bit about this with the kind of adage like absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's why Arturo Escobar's call for plural versality means so much to me. I think a radical, like building a world where different worlds fit doesn't allow that single master narrative or that monolithic hegemony to reign. It's one of the things, so I have a really long piece about Settlers of Catan, and I cut it way down for you because it's mostly me just ranting. But really, because there is no way to interact with the Isle outside of the kind of bustling and cheerful settler development, what it does is it reinscribes a kind of master narrative, and I'm using that term intentionally, that reinscribes Western modernity and colonialism as the only horizon. So what does it mean to have multiple horizons? What does it mean to have multiple worlds fitting within that world? It's why Catan is such a good example. It really reinscribes through its rules a single world. So yeah, thinking about the plural verse, I think the turn to the multiverse, which has become increasingly popular in contemporary science fiction, is one of the ways of thinking about how we might avoid building yet another power monolith.
Yeah, I think, using the plural verse, but also I like the point you made earlier about rereading and like iterating over the world. I feel like within the world building and like science fiction community, there's a debate about like utopia, dystopia, utopia. And I find the worlds I find more interesting are asking like both what does it mean for new comforts to exist, but what are the new problems that emerge? Because I mostly approach world building from this like belief that existence is about experimenting with connection and different ways of connecting, and how do these different futures allow us to explore more expansive ways of connecting. And again, sort of this interest in the mundane life in these worlds produces like the small frictions. Yeah, like if I design, like what's a world where everything's built for everyone who's my height, and what sort of frictions does that produce for me, but also for other people? Yeah, like the microphone. And so I think it's both the like reiterating over the stories we tell to see like, are you just making a gilded, like I used to love Blade Runner, and then I realized, oh, this is literally just a slave catcher. And it's a story about white people in LA with, like, I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be in Chinatown, but like Asian people in the background. And so like once I realized that, I was like, cool, well, what could this have been? Because there are interesting questions that emerge. And so yeah, I think it's both the plural verse, but also iterating and making sure that like the problems, the pain points of this world are actually different than the ones we're experiencing. And yeah, I guess some of them will always be the same, but like puberty.
I have sort of a follow-up on this with a question that you posed towards the beginning of your presentation, but what kind of questions do you all ask about the future? And I also like to think about the future as being sort of, you said your favoritism for like living in the present, but I think of the future as already like being here. So when you're moving between that, what kind of questions do you like to think about for the future?
It is funny that you're asking that in this moment because I've been having a hard time engaging with the future, despite that being most of what I do and how I make my money. I said before that I think like existence is about experimenting and connection. And the question I often ask is just like, what would it mean to connect with this thing or with this person? A question I like to ask my students is a check-in question, which is sometimes hard, but like in this moment, what's your aspirational state of being? Yeah, like for me, I think about like the present as like being, there was the like Afro-Nowist community, but like I don't like work, I like relationships, and work is a vehicle for that in many ways. And so it's like, how do I create aesthetically and comfortable vehicles for me to like be in relationship with other people? It's often, I mean, there's like pleasure activism. So it's just like, what actually feels good about this? Yeah, my boyfriend recently made me aware of the fact that anytime I visit someplace new, I ask the question of what would it mean to live here? Both like what would the processes of getting there, but also what are the certain attributes and ephemera and like what things would make it comfortable for me to live here. Yeah, that's from personal. I'm trying to think of what other questions.
So I guess I am an avowed presentist in the face of historical accuracy. I don't know that I'm an avowed presentist in favor of thinking about futurity. I really think it's imperative to creating a habitable world into the future that we seriously ask ourselves about the costs and consequences of futurity in this kind of linear industrialist, Western masculinist way that has, in our lifetimes, always been the horizon. It's one of the reasons that Lafayette's work is so inspiring to me, thinking about a polychrome world or recentering the margins, but how we might develop new language and new tools through those languages to tell different narratives about the future that include different people and include different perspectives. Honestly, when I think about the future, I think about work to do, not work in a labor capitalist sense, but how much needs to get done. And that makes me feel two things, which I was kind of talking to you about earlier. I feel grief. I feel intense ecological grief about mass extinction, about deforestation, about island nations. And I think there's a capitalist imperative to be happy and to get up and be productive. And there isn't a lot of cultural space to do the grief work that's necessary to inhabit the environmental world of the future, at least if the current trajectory remains. So I want to provide space to mourn. And then, like all the scholar activists who really inspire me, like Angela Davis, I want to politically instrumentalize hope, because to change the world, we have to believe we can do so. So for me, hope is a strategy to approach not wallowing, not burning out, and thinking about how we might build a better future. And I don't mean better or future in a linear or progressive way. One of the things that's so inspiring about indigenous futurity, for example, is that it gives us the figure of the wormhole, time folded in on itself, the past and present touching and meeting to create a new world, as a space where turning to the past can actually help us reimagine a more just future. So this is something my students, especially as art and design students, are so intense about, but they really feel like language fails because of its built-in ideological baggage, and English as a colonial and capitalist language, an objectifying language that uses nouns, people, place, and things as the building blocks of how it makes meaning. We have to break that language and then make it do what we want. And that's one of the reasons why I find poetry and poetics to be so inspiring. Poets are using language as a container to make new imaginative meaning from different perspectives. So, yeah, thinking about the future, I really also, and this I think maybe brings back a kind of queer inflection to our conversation, I'm always so disappointed by and frustrated by reproductive futurity, and I'm always challenging my students, what does it mean to imagine and access the future and futurity outside of imagining it for your children, or imagining the world for your children? How do we imagine a future that matters, that we are invested in, that we care about in an embodied and material way that doesn't depend on biological offspring inheriting it? And it's a challenge, but my students have really risen to it. One wrote an incredible short story from the perspective of a redwood to get past the kind of human lifespan as like a temporal limit. Yeah, I'll stop.
First, really, thank you for your very generous presentation. I will try to have a really more simple question. I was interested to know what could be the role, or what is the role of the collective, like collective practice in your research work. I mean, as historians, researchers, we are most of our time alone, at least physically alone, but with lots of ghosts around us. So I wanted to hear a bit, how you work in collective, how do you imagine collectively also, maybe?
I think reading is about having a relationship with the world. Again, this is why I want to resist the idea that the literary text exists over here and we have to formally close read only what's on the page. And this was something that was so inspiring about being in Octavia Butler's archives, is for her writing and reading were about, I mean, she's famously solitary, right? She spends a lot of time alone. But reading and writing are about an active connection to the world. They are about being in camaraderie with people that she's not physically present with. So I don't want to think just because something is mediated, it's not real, right? So I became a literature professor because I'm a super nerd and I wanted to read all day, and there aren't jobs that pay you to do that. Surprise. So for me, reading is really like an orientation I have to the world. It brings me out of my perspective. It brings me out of my physical limits, and it helps me have a renewed relationship with time, with the environment, with the people in my lives. So that's an answer, but it is a solitary one. So the other one, which is why I wanted to focus on pedagogy in my talk, is that I think about my classroom as a collective. And one of the things that I cut from the super way too long version of the talk was a conversation I like to have with my students that's facilitated by Leanne Bettisimosake Simpson's essay, Land as Pedagogy. And in that essay, she offers a very spot-on critique of Western education systems as foundationally dependent on non-consent. And so we read this essay together, and I ask my students, in what ways have you experienced non-consent in your educational experience? And it's everything from not being able to go to the bathroom when you need to go to the bathroom, to being forced to study topics that you don't give a shit about. It is everything from being surveilled in the way that you are graded by your teachers, by being forced to sit at uncomfortable desks that don't fit your body. And so we make a map of all the ways in which how we've ended up in this classroom has been predicated on our non-consent. And then we talk about how we might, as a collective, in the pre-given space of Western academia, try to create a more consensual space for us to be a learning community going forward. Some of the things that come up are, which I was really excited about. I had a student this last spring. She wanted to make sure that we knew that we had the right to change our minds, to contradict ourselves, and to start one place and end up somewhere totally different. We reserve the right as a class to be nonlinear and to go on tangents. And then some of it is more material as well. So I always let my students stand, get up. They don't have to ask. They can leave the classroom if they need to. They don't need to ask to go to the bathroom. They can stretch. They can draw and doodle, which is really important for RISD students. They can eat. they can drink. They don't need to ask my permission to do these things. Another way is that I often provide a rubric and I have them grade their own work. I ask them to advocate for the grade that they feel like they've earned so that they don't feel surveyed, and there's a moment where they can either advocate for a grade that they haven't earned to try to stack their grade, in which case then I have some work to do, or they can really be transparent, like, I had a really bad week, but I want you to know I spent a lot of hours on this assignment, and it's an opportunity for me to see them as people. And so I hesitated to answer your question by saying the classroom, because there's all kinds of weird authority and power dynamics. I get to be in charge, so it's much easier to be in a group of people when you're in charge, right? So I wanted to try to provide an example for you of the kind of pedagogy that I hope transforms a classroom into a learning community. But for me, it's why, I keep coming back to bell hooks. I'm rereading Teaching to Transgress this summer to try to get me all riled up for September. And in it, she says, to teach with pleasure is an act of resistance. To show up and be enthusiastic about the topic at hand is radical, and that our students do not encounter it in research universities. So I've been thinking about how little space there is for collectivity in late-stage capitalism, and so how we might take this pre-given social order that we all live in and do our best to be in good relation with the people we find ourselves in it with.
I think it is always interesting in this context, because I'm sharing about my work, and yet most of my work is in collaboration. I think about the act of collaging. It's someone else created this piece, and I'm working with them and working with their work to reinterpret it. Most of the world building, the ones that I prefer to do are when I'm with friends and other collaborators, and we are piggybacking off of each other, because I can't contain the world, or a world. I can put sort of aspects of it, but to make it feel lived in, I feel more excited and alive when I'm working with other people. But I also think the world that I'm trying to pull into this world, there's this space for the vibrancy of emotion. And so it's both the grief and joy and pleasure and confusion and silliness and intelligence, for me, is best practiced, and by engaging with it in this moment, I'm training my body to will it into the future. And so that has to be with people. I think, again, sort of coming from an urban planning perspective and sort of a myth making, the way in which our cities are designed, the way time sort of regulates our movements, this sort of, we were talking about this this myth of the traditional family as nuclear, when that's not how we as a species have existed. It is a sort of mythological and structural design to separate us. And so for me, this work is not just in the creative process, but in the lived process. It has to be with other people. And again, not in sort of not just in this is fun, but also this is hard. The burden of the world is not something that individuals should carry alone, both the one we live in and the one we're trying to build. And so collaboration is both important for my life, but I think the best worlds are ones that are made, at least the ones that I've worked on, they're ones that are made in collaboration. I just have a whole Rolodex of thinking people I've worked with personally, but the authors that have inspired me. I think that's always sort of the hard thing. It's just the lineage of collaborators that come to a moment. Yeah.
I have been so excited and thrilled by the growing community of folks who are just super jazzed about Octavia Butler's work. So this is another moment where I think the collective extends the world building of someone. I think about Adrienne Maree Brown and Tashi Rogan's podcasts. the Parables podcast, and now I think that they're reading like all of her books together. So when my students and I are reading Butler, I always refer that, like if they want a chapter by chapter breakdown, to listen to the podcast. Tashi Rogan made an opera. The graphic novel adaptations. So there's also, and I mentioned this earlier, that I feel like I'm always at my best when I'm fangirling other amazing science fiction creators, but I think that there is opportunity to be enthusiastic about great stuff with other people, which isn't really radical. But I think about the pressure my students are under to be creative and to produce art. And I want them to know that there are places to turn for community and nourishment for inspiration, that they don't have to suck their own well dry. And this is real at RISD. Like, students exist in a culture where they believe that their suffering is what produces their great art. And so for me, I want to flip that narrative. I want them to listen to Adrienne Maree Brown's Parables and get on board with the Octavia Butler fan community as a source of inspiration so that they're not tortured. I don't think the tortured artist is a myth that I'm not, especially now as a teacher of artists, invested in. I don't want that for my students. So it sounds glib to say being a fan of stuff with other people who are fans of the same stuff, but I think that there is inspiration there, and there's also a way of continuing Octavia's world building, especially given that she died at such a young age and with unfinished work, right? So I think there's a way of taking that up too.
Well, thank you so much for both of your presentations, and thank you for also spending so much time with us outside today. I was really moved by both of your presentations, and Rafiko just told me very briefly it falls to me to chart a narrative arc to close kind of this portion of our questions. So, Lafayette, I was so startled kind of how you started with transportation planning, in the sense that you immediately completely reflipped the script about what many in the room maybe think about it, like what it means to think 40 years or 50 years in the future, and then what that burden is and what kind of worlds that has already created. And so maybe I wanted to put kind of like another person's work on the table that maybe, I don't know, is interesting in returning both like to what you said about experimenting with connection, and Sage, what you said about thinking about non-biological reproductive futures. So I apologize in advance because this is a quote I've thought a lot about, and I feel kind of like a cop-out to now turn to that. I hadn't prepared it, so that's why I had the computer open. But so in 1981, June Jordan spoke to the Gay and Lesbian Student Alliance, and she said something that I've been thinking with while you were talking, and I'll just read that for a second, will only be very short. She said, our survival requires that we alter our environment so that we can live, and so that we can hold each other's hands, and so that we can kiss in the streets and in the daylight of our existence without terror and without the violent and sometimes fatal reactions of the busybodies of America. I read this quote because I think in the space of so that, which is maybe the space that's most overlooked in the quote, June Jordan's opened something that both of you talked about, that is to elicit the audience, the listeners, in the project of so that. And so also thinking with her a bit more and her life, and that she made it her mission, I don't know, saying also like in the 90s, you know, there's a moment to quit writing and start organizing, much to your point, to create poetry for the people. And then I also think that Alexis Pauline Gumbs, who's really the person who like has so much thought in that vein, has been really invested in kind of thinking with non-reproductive futures in the Mobile Homecoming Project. And so I was wondering what you think about, this is a long-winded way to ask kind of like what other classrooms, I guess, exist that are maybe non-reproductive in the way we've been talking about, and that are an experiment in connection.
I think that there's a moment here to advocate for the scholar activist. I know as a grad student at the UC system in California, we wildcat struck, which means we struck without the support of our union. And one of the things that came from that strike, which was not more money or more housing or more healthcare, we didn't get any wins, but was Strike University, which was an attempt to reimagine the UC from the picket line. So classes were taught by allied professors and grad students that were open to the public about whatever topic the teacher wanted to teach. Our strike was interrupted by COVID, and so Strike U went online, and it continued to operate with free public classes for years after our strike ended. In the spring, our students at RISD, our RISD Students for Justice in Palestine occupied the administration building for 4 days, and one of the things that came from that were teach-ins at the rally. I gave 2 of them. This was an opportunity for me to meet community members and students not in my classes to talk about the things I care about. And I gave a teach-in about science fiction, speculative fiction, and imagining the future. And I got to center some really cool Palestinian science fiction, Palestine Plus 100, which is a collection of Palestinian writers who are tasked to imagine 100 years after the Nakba. So I think that there is a lot of opportunity. The stuff that we're talking about, for me, it makes sense in the college classroom because that's what I do. But there are many ways in which we can have these conversations outside of that. I know it's kind of, it might seem, again, glib, but community book clubs have been the most amazing experiences for me as a reader. I got to be in a book club reading Louise Erdrich's The Roundhouse with Deborah Miranda last fall, which was transformative. My sister and I started a pandemic book club. I was part of an online book club for undergraduate students in the UC during pandemic. This is also an opportunity for us to have more casual conversations about the stories that transform our lives. And I know professors who do book clubs through public libraries. I know professors who work with refugee organizations. I think if you love to teach, there are a lot of opportunities to leave the traditional classroom. The last thing I'll say is that I want to bring the non-human and the environment in here a little bit, and I also think figuring out ways of fostering relationships with non-human life is really important. Too often, the classroom, I think, is technological, it's inside. I'm not trying to create an inside-outside binary, but who matters, who gets to speak, who gets to determine the relationships, what those relationships look like. My body and space it's all designed for humans, and there are not a lot of animate life forms that are non-human. So I think it's also really important for us, to think with Simpson, if land is pedagogy, how do we teach ourselves through land and through land relations, and also how do we encourage those around us to foster more than human relationships too?
Yeah, I think it's always, I prefer going after you, because no, you're just great answers, so I just get to piggyback. But it is interesting to think about. Well, there are 2 thoughts of having sort of the other than human, and then thinking about the generational, that's the word, generational sort of separation that we've created. For the other, the more than human, I So I grew up in Wisconsin, and I grew up in, I don't know if it's still the norm, if it was new, but I grew up in an era where we learned about the geological time of the state. And so my relationship to, someone made a joke recently that like, they keep meeting kids from Wisconsin who talk about the glaciers like they're their friends and that they were there like yesterday, not like hundreds of thousands of years ago. And yet, for me, there is sort of this training early on to be able to like sit in a place like in Wisconsin and sort of think about what were the more than human and human processes that made this place, and how is it like taught how it relates to itself and how I can relate to it. And I really appreciated, especially in the early days of the pandemic, because I had moved back to live with my parents and like my siblings came back, and it was this weird, fun island where like despite being with my nuclear family, it made it very clear that like the nuclear family is not sustainable. Because it was so much easier to maintain a household when you have 5 working adults. It's much more easy to maintain a home when you have 5 working adults and can distribute labor. But it also gave me time to sort of just like sit in the grass and like reflect on the tall, like the prairie grass and like the oak savanna, but also mourn the oak savanna, to think about the way that land has changed and like nourishes me, but also is doing that for its own reasons and not for me. And so it was interesting to be able to build off of like the outdoor education that I had as a kid to prepare me in that moment to be still and like learn from things that engage with interspecies relationships and time differently. I think a big part of the danger of like the classroom is that we've created a very productive time frame for knowledge. Like the classroom is a very, like you need to learn this for this so you become, well, you can question what is the purpose of education, but like it is much more like you need to be a worker, and not more than that. And that creates a sort of time scarcity that I don't know, being slow in nature like was helpful for like rejecting time isn't scarce in that way. But I also think when you think about the classroom and like what it means to like learn and to teach and imagine worlds outside of the classroom, one of the things I can't remember where I saw this, but I like to repeat, and I often repeat in my urban design studios, is like, I think we don't need to be a productive society, like a sexually reproductive society, but I do think all healthy societies that are productive have children integrated. And we live in a society that sees children as political objects, as errant future adults that need to be conformed, as opposed to like generative, valuable members of society. And then on the flip side, it's the same with the elderly. Once you lose your like reproductive value and your youth, we relegate you to a different part of society. And so for me, I see the classroom not in sort of a reverting back to some traditional family structure, but like how can we imagine other kinship structures and actively take the time. Because like teaching kids in a generative and like abundant way is inefficient and slow, but it's also beautiful and like imaginative. I'm like trying to work on a piece now, imagining a world in which our like digital and physical publics are centered on early adolescence' need for belonging, and like how that changes everything, and like the messiness of it. And rather than trying to order the world and trying to make it simpler, how do you embrace the complexity that is adolescence, the scariness and beauty and weirdness and ugliness that everyone who makes it out of puberty goes through. Yeah, so I think it's like, part of it is taking time to allow other classrooms to emerge. Part of it is like rejecting our sort of generational separations and like the sort of capitalist need for like youth as a market, and like working productive age as a market and elderly retiree as a market, and rejecting that, but then also like taking the time to learn from other things, and being able to train ourselves to learn from other things and see other classrooms.
So for those who haven't been in the workshop, I think I'll just say very quickly, and then I'll pass to you a few words about what we've all been kind of involved with this week. As a group, we thought for this week at the CCA, it was really productive to think about questions of how gender and sexuality studies, including queer and trans studies, allow us to think about the built environment, but more so, and this is like Rio has said this, I think like a couple of times throughout the week, also how these theories actually allow us to maybe defamiliarize or denaturalize terms that we think like, you know, on the face of it have nothing to do with them, like the environment or the state. And so we were really interested with everybody who's in the room and everybody who already came to the CCA with a variety of projects to actually take the idea of crosswords or the crossing of words that are, you know, specific but actually arbitrary, only made connecting by their formal arrangement, to kind of delve deeper into these questions. Okay.
Thank you. And all I'll add is, and hopefully we can talk about it tomorrow, around this tension of the historian's craft and the way that I think world building may or may not seem connected, but given the curatorial mission of the CCA, given the physical proximity that we're in, we've asked students to take one of their historical terms, which is a kind of historian's crafts tool, and intersect it with another scholar's research to find a way to begin to world build, you could say, or think of histories, whether it is content or context, that is, being in something like this institution, to kind of build a spatial history from that intersection. Currently, students have not been paired yet. That is going to be part of your workshop tomorrow that everyone will do. But I guess what we can do now is turn it over and listen to the students' word.
Oh, should we go for it? Okay.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentations first. I hope you will have some time to make questions about them, but well, let's switch the topic apparently. My name is Tatiana. I come from the ETH in Zurich in the architecture department. And I'm working now with two concepts. One of them is exception, the other one is experimentation. And one of the objects that I'm working with is with a game board from the 19th century, so it resonates very much. Also, the word experimentation appeared in the presentation. So, yeah, thank you very much.
Hi, thank you very much for the talk. I'm Joske, also from the ETH Zurich, and I work with the two keywords, opacity and categorization.
Hi, my name is Laure, and my words are, well, I'm from UQAM, Montreal, and the University of Geneva as well. And my two words are moving as mouvant et émouvant, and control.
Hi, my name is Elena. I'm coming from the Oslo School of Architecture in Norway, and my word is crisis.
My name is Kaval. I'm coming from the University of Toronto, and my term is transient matter.
Hi, my name is Paul. I'm based out of Brown University, and my word is employee.
My name is Irina from Colombia. I'm working with organization, refusal, and maybe now cooperation or coalition, but we'll see.
Hello, I'm Priyanka. I am based out of Cornell University, and my word is shit.
I'm Max. I'm from Princeton. My word is traffic.
Hi, I'm MC. I'm coming from the University of Pennsylvania, history of architecture, and my word is fantasy.
My name is Isabella. I'm based between Rome and Palermo, and the word I'm working with is desire.
Hi, thank you so much for the inspiring talk. My name is Gent. I come from TU Delft, the Netherlands. My terms are crystal, crystallization, and clouds.
Hi, I'm from University of Hong Kong. I'm working on the term materiality.
Hi, my name is Zheng. I'm from ADP, University of Sydney. My keyword is performing.
Hi, thank you for the talk. My name is Sarp. I'm from the University of California, Los Angeles, and my keyword is human rights.
Wonderful. Thank you for doing that. This will all be further contextualized tomorrow, and our conversation continues back here with this group. But thank you to all of you. Thank you so much, and we will continue the conversation. A few words of thanks before we conclude. Many, many people help make these events happen. Our digital team, public team, Isidore Chiquan-Marinier from research. Also, I will point out, any research event, we have our fantastic reference librarians, Tim and Loris, who are here this evening, who help all this research happen. And thank you to our research fellows as well, who are here to support the PhD students and our collaborators. Okay, thanks everyone, and good night.